Good morning. I'm Maricopa County Attorney Rachel Mitchell. I want to begin today's news conference about talking about some items in the news in the last 24 hours. Yesterday, the voters of San Francisco recalled the San Francisco District Attorney Chesa Boudin. Upon Boudin's taking office, their community saw a dramatic increase in murder rates, violent crime, shoplifting, burglaries, and open-air drug trade. But yesterday, 61% of voters in that community stood up for their community and said this type of lawlessness will not be tolerated. On the same day, our community witnessed the brutal beating of an innocent person just doing their job at a local retail establishment. After some hard work by the police, he was arrested, and at my direction, this office requested and received a $100,000 cash bond on the suspect, which will ensure that he appear in court. Last night, I learned that a case was submitted previously against this same individual for misconduct involving weapons. Under the previous administration, this office turned down charges. I personally have directed staff to re-review this submittal. Let me be very clear. People who commit heinous and violent attacks on members of our community will be held accountable. As county attorney, this office will stand with victims of crime and with law enforcement to keep dangerous individuals off of our streets. And with that, I understand some of you have some questions for me. Good morning.
Melissa Blasius, ABC 15. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
First of all, about the Chuck Ryan case.
Mm-hmm.
In the Chuck Ryan case, he received a Class 6 felony disorderly conduct charge involving weapons. But we found multiple similar cases that involve someone with a gun brandished or pointed at police officers, where they're actually charged with the F2 aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, with the police officer being the victim. You mentioned one of these cases in your termination letter to April Sponsel, saying that you felt that that case was overcharged. Will you now go through these F2 aggravated assault cases that went through the First Responders Bureau and relook at every single one of them to see if they were appropriately charged in both light of the April Sponsel situation as well as the Chuck Ryan charges?
Melissa, if you recall last year, I was the division chief that was assigned to take over the First Responder Bureau after the previous division chief left. And that was one of my assignments, was to look at those cases. And so I was the person who identified those cases. So the answer is yes, I already have. In terms of speaking generally about aggravated assault cases, what people need to understand is that for aggravated assault charges to be filed, it's not simply the pointing or brandishing of a gun. It has to involve, if there is no injury, the intentional or the intent to place somebody else in reasonable apprehension of their life. So you have to prove the intent. And that is an element of the crime, and that certainly has to be present for us to charge aggravated assault.
So that's your interpretation of the law? Because we've
No,
other
that's
people from within who have been in this office, as well as judges who are implying that it's not the intending to give the threat, it's the intentional brandishing of the gun. If someone's in fear, then indeed it's the aggravated assault.
It's not my reading of the law, it's the way the law reads. So I'd tell you to look at ARS 13-1203A2. Any other questions?
I've got more.
Okay, I figured.
So your office said that April Sponsel engaged in a pattern of extreme overcharging. Are you planning to review any more of her past cases, and how far back are you going to go?
Obviously, that's an active personnel matter, so I have to be careful not to discuss the details of that. What I would say is this, that I started in this office a prosecution integrity unit, and my intention is to keep that staffed, and it is staffed by actually a 22-year judge and former prosecutor. So if there are some additional cases from the past beyond the time that she was in the First Responder Bureau that people have concerns about and want us to look at those, we can certainly do that through the Prosecution Integrity Unit. We're willing to do that.
Do you know how many cases the Prosecution Integrity Unit has reviewed at this point?
I know that when I left that unit, I would have to look those numbers up. I don't want to give you the wrong numbers.
Are you concerned, now that you've had several weeks in office, that there is a larger oversight issue within MCAO?
I want to make sure that there aren't other cases where there has been an oversight issue. Certainly, if somebody wants to bring those to our attention, we would look at them. But those are the cases that I identified when I was the division chief that took over First Responder Bureau.
Anybody else?
Can I ask you about the Uber operator?
Mm-hmm.
She was offered tentatively, I'm not sure how to even phrase that, but she was proposed a plea deal. She said she wasn't interested in that. The prosecutor said they needed to run that up the chain. I assume that means they need to ask you if you are on board with that. So my first question is, are you willing to offer a probation plea deal for the operator in that Uber autonomous car?
Because it's an active case, it wouldn't be appropriate for me to talk about plea negotiations. I can tell you that in my previous role as division chief, I had reviewed that case, so I'm very familiar with it and the evidence related to that. And certainly, cases like that will be reviewed at a higher level.
There has historically, over the last several years, been a backlog of review of officer-involved shooting cases to determine whether or not the shootings were justified. At this point, where does the backlog stand, and where do you want to see it? Because, I mean, at this point, many of these families have been waiting for a year or longer to hear whether or not an officer is going to be charged.
Yeah, absolutely. When I took office, I inherited a significant backlog, and so one of the things that we did was look at a way to streamline the process. Now, I don't want to make it so fast that we lose effectiveness or don't have all of the things that we need to consider to make a right decision. But we did find some ways to streamline that process. And what I would say is just 2 weeks ago, we looked at some so that we could reduce that backlog by 15%. We're going to continue using the streamlined process to get that further down. Some of those cases are awaiting completion of the submittal. As you know, the investigation can be submitted to us, but we may have to wait for additional things such as the medical examiner's report, which takes longer, or the toxicology report, because that's sent out. So once those are submitted, my goal is to have those reviewed much more quickly so that families can get answers on that, and law enforcement as well.
What's your general goal? 6 months, 9 months?
To have the backlog reduced? I think by 6 months we could definitely have the backlog cleaned up significantly, if not gone.
I've got a question about marijuana possession. There's been some county attorneys in Pinal that tried a case for commercial drivers, just charging them on possession under the Federal Motor Carrier Act. There's an active case in Mojave County. These cases are brought by state troopers in many cases, and I'm curious what your disposition might be if one of those possession cases were to come forward in Maricopa.
Yeah, I've read articles about the cases that you're talking about, and I think there's an important distinction to be made between commercial carriers that are hauling it as a product to another location and commercial carriers who are having it in their possession for personal use. So that's certainly one of the things that I would look at. If any of those cases were submitted to our office, in addition to considering that, we would look at all of the other surrounding circumstances before charging.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, a driver who is working for a licensed dispensary transporting marijuana for assuming everything else is above board there, would not be something you'd be interested in prosecuting because they're in the course of their job. It's not their personal, it's not something in their pocket that was their own.
That would be one of the factors I would consider, yes, definitely. Because I understand that was probably the larger concern involved in those cases.
It sounds like you are interested then in prosecuting people who have personal possession if they're behind the wheel of a commercial vehicle.
You know, additional safety regulations apply to commercial vehicle operators, and there's a good reason why that happens. And so, yes, I think that's a valid consideration if they're personally using drugs. And as you know, we still are able to prosecute people who are under the influence of marijuana while driving if they are impaired, just like we would with any other legally prescribed drug.
Just to be clear though,
Yeah.
these cases are not people who were charged with being impaired. They were simply possessing it, and I'm asking you.
Understood.
Clearly, I think you would prosecute someone who was impaired behind the wheel of a commercial vehicle, but would you be interested in prosecuting someone who was simply in possession of marijuana if they were behind the wheel of a commercial vehicle?
We would look at all the facts of the case, yes.
The Sean Pena case, most of the charges against former officer Sean Pena ended in a hung jury. There's a hearing later this month to talk about status of the case. Does the county attorney's office want to pursue a second trial against him?
Yes, and in fact, we have a status conference on June 21st for that case, and that is the intention is to retry that case.
Why do you think it's so important to go to retrial here?
Why it's so important to what?
To retry him.
To seek justice for the victims. As you know, there was not guilty as to one victim, but there are still 2 other victims.
Anybody else? I guess, how are you guys doing?
I knew you were going to.
You're rocking it though, man.
I was waiting.
Really question.
I was waiting for it.
How are you doing on staffing? Because that has been raised as a huge issue in this office, the percent of vacancies that you had as a couple of months ago. How is this going now?
You know, thank you for asking that, because that is a huge issue that has a ripple effect, as you know, to so many other parts of this office. It is going well. We have launched a very robust, I'll say, recruitment campaign, not only within Arizona, but outside Arizona. We've also put in additional incentives for people to come here to prosecute. We are in the process of recruiting some experienced prosecutors. I won't go into further detail about that, to bring them back into this office to assist with us. So I think it's going very well. I get briefings on how many people have left the office. You're going to have a natural attrition in an office this size, as well as how many people have been brought in. And the number of people coming in is getting larger than the people that are leaving. So that's a great step forward.
What are the incentives?
One of the incentives that we're looking at is if a lawyer is from a state that has reciprocity with Arizona, but to come here and get licensed costs, I think, about $1,800. When you've gone through 4 years of college and 3 years of law school, the average debt for some of these law student graduates is well over $100,000. So one of the things that we're looking at doing is reimbursing them the cost of moving their license here, with the provision that they stay for a number of years and then not have to pay it back. So that's just one example.
Can you just touch a little bit on the loan repayment also incentives that we're
Yeah.
bringing forward?
Yeah, I mean, we have great loan repayment incentives here. When you've been here 1 year, I think, you get reimbursed for loan repayments, and then because you're in public service, at 10 years, your loans are repaid. So that is, while we don't pay as much as large law firms, that is certainly a huge incentive to people who have really, honestly, a mountain of debt. So there are just a number of things that we're looking at to get that message out, as well as to increase the incentives.
All right.
Okay,
Thanks, guys.
thank you.